Forum's 2023 annual meeting. I'm joined here in our studio in Geneva by four of my colleagues on the Forum's managing board: Saadia Zahidi, Brende, our president, Huay, and Mirek, Dusek. But to get us started and to set the direction for the annual meeting, let's turn to the Forum's founder and executive chairman, Professor Klaus Schwab. Klaus.
Thank you, Adrian, and a cordial welcome to all of you joining this press conference announcing the annual meeting 2023 of the World Economic Forum. Here we are at the beginning of the new year, looking ahead to our future, characterized by unprecedented multiple crises. And even worse, those economic, environmental, social, and geopolitical crises are converging and conflating, creating an extremely versatile and uncertain future. So far, it's no surprise that generally we are all stuck in a crisis mindset. And that leads to short-term decision-making that may have long-term unintended damaging consequences. Davos should help to shift that mindset. It's a bit like putting on varifocal lenses, glasses that enable us to clearly assess and address the short-term situation, but at the same time allow us to look further ahead. The annual meeting at Davos shall try to make sure that leaders do not remain trapped in this crisis mindset, but develop a longer-term, constructive perspective and to shape the future in a more sustainable, more inclusive, and more resilient way. This year's annual meeting has a record participation across the board. It has an unprecedented participation from governments, international organizations, and enterprises, but also strong engagement of civil society, of social entrepreneurs, of activists, and above all, the participation of the younger generation whose future is at stake. I'm also delighted by the strong participation from smaller and emerging countries. It is so exciting that at the beginning of the year, we can meet again in person. Only personal interaction creates the necessary level of trust, which we need so much in our fragmented and fractured world. To bring people together for an informal dialogue in a remote Swiss village such as Davos can be or should be a good recipe to restore trust. The World Economic Forum was very active and successful in stimulating virtual interaction among our constituents since the COVID pandemic broke out just 3 years ago. But the most productive way to foster cooperation is the combination of virtual and face-to-face interaction. In this respect, most of the issues discussed in Davos have been thoroughly prepared and will be followed up by virtual forum task forces. The theme of our meeting in Davos is cooperation in a fragmented world. One of the root causes of this fragmentation is actually a lack of cooperation. This in turn increases fragmentation in society and leads even more to short-term and self-serving policy making. It's a truly vicious circle. The problem today is that decision makers are overwhelmed by the complexity of issues they have to face, and no sustainable solution can be found if we do not see the interconnectivity and interdependence of all those issues, and if we are not able to connect the dots. That is why we always try in Davos to focus on the global agenda in a comprehensive and in a holistic manner. The World Economic Forum is, as you know, is the international organization for public-private cooperation. And public-private cooperation becomes even more essential today with the rising role of the state on the one hand, and the accelerating importance of business-driven innovation and technology on the other hand. In view of what is at stake, it is crucial that the annual meeting in Davos does not take place in a secluded way, but is a catalyst for creating public awareness, public discussion, and possibly solutions for the challenges which we face, particularly at the beginning of 2023. With your participation, we hope to achieve all those objectives, and thank you for helping to interpret the deep systemic transformation processes the world is undergoing. Thank you, and back to you, Adrian.
Klaus, thank you very much. Can I turn, Børge, to you to give us some perspective on the key issues and themes that we'll see addressed in the meeting?
Well, thank you, Adrian. And there is no doubt that our 53rd annual meeting in Davos will happen against the most complex geopolitical and geoeconomic backdrop in decades. So much is at stake. How can we avoid a global recession, soaring energy and food prices, and also how to really avoid further escalation of the global crisis. We have the key players globally to make sure that this can be discussed and also to create collaboration even in this fractured world. And we know there are opportunities. We have record participation of head of states and governments, 52, and if we include them, cabinet ministers, we have 379 public figures at our annual meeting. We also know there is a lot of focus on Europe. Is Europe going into recession, or is Europe really holding up much better? We see that inflation is abating. We see there is more stability on the gas side. We have 30 head of states and governments from Europe, and also with the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, with us. We also this time have quite a large Asian footprint. We expect a high-level Chinese delegation and participation. We have the new presidents from Korea, the Philippines, and also high-level delegations from other Asian countries. As mentioned, it really is a lot at stake when it comes to the global economy. How to make sure that we avoid a global recession, how to avoid low growth, high inflation, and high debt. We have never had so many finance ministers in Davos as this year. We have 56 finance ministers coming and 19 governors of central banks. And we also know that there will be no real recovery without a trade and investment recovery. We need to avoid the global fragmentation of the economy, and we have 30 trade ministers with us, and there also will be informal meetings among the trade ministers to also prepare the next multilateral negotiations. Despite the terrible latest developments in Brasilia, we will have a strong Brazilian ministerial delegation headed by the finance minister. We also will have Marina Silva back with us, the former environment minister, and now the new environment minister, sending strong signals about stopping deforestation of Amazon, and will join forces with the new president, Petro of Colombia, president of Ecuador, so also a good Latin American footprint with us. We know that global challenges can only be addressed by global solutions. Record amount of head of international organizations will join us. 39 head of the international organizations, to be precise, headed by Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, and also with Bretton Woods leaders, Kristalina Georgieva, IMF, and Dr. Ngozi at the WTO. And because it is really about finding ways of collaborating under difficult circumstances, we also have 35 foreign ministers from key countries with us. The African footprint is also very broad. President Ramaphosa of South Africa, that is president of BRICS this year, will join us with other key presidents and also rally around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. If successfully implemented, can create more than 30 million additional jobs. Climate and energy nexus is critical. We have more than 30 ministers in this field preparing the COP28 in UAE, Abu Dhabi in the fall. We're also signing an MOU between the World Economic Forum and the UAE on preparations for this. Also, Secretary Kerry from the US will be there laying out the US strategy for climate and financing, together with other strong representatives from the Biden administration. We will have 3 cabinet members, the administrator of USAID in addition, and also the FBI director. So this should be the basis for really, really strong discussions, finding solutions that are necessary in this very complex world.
Børge, thank you very much. Saadia, you lead the forum's work on jobs and the economy. Can you give us an idea of what's on the agenda for those issues in Davos?
Thank you. I think as both Klaus and Børge mentioned, there is a high risk of a short-term crisis-driven mindset. And there are 3 areas that I'm going to tell you about where we're trying to move beyond that and take a more medium-term and long-term outlook and set up the kinds of initiatives and coalitions that can move us all forward towards cooperation. First is around the prosperity agenda. So what are the right ways in which to rethink growth and investment in this present era? Clearly, it is not the growth that we have seen in the past that can be damaging to the environment, that can have negative repercussions for people. So how do we build the inclusive, sustainable, and resilient growth? A group of leaders from the public and the private sector will be coming together to address exactly that question, designing a framework and starting to align around that new agenda. That also includes thinking more about the markets of tomorrow, the specific areas of investment, everything from power storage to education technologies that can create the right kind of resilient, sustainable, and inclusive growth of the future. But of course, we do also have to look at the short term. And so we're actually going to kick off the week on Monday with our chief economist's outlook that lays out the agenda for 2023, what the possibilities might be, the risk of recession, what may happen in terms of inflation, in terms of interest rates, and where some of the greatest opportunities lie in terms of various geographies in the global economy. The second area is around people, so the human capital agenda. Without adequate investments in skilling and in education, none of these opportunities can really play out, and nor will we have the kind of societal resilience that is needed to be prepared for future inevitable shocks. So we'll have a meeting of the Reskilling Revolution champions, and we'll be announcing that we have actually crossed the milestone that we had set for ourselves 3 years ago, which was to reach 1 billion people by 2030. We should at this stage be 30% of the target, and we will actually go well beyond that, and we'll be announcing that at the meeting. Critical if we want to ensure that people have the skills and opportunities for the future of the global economy. A second element around that area is having the right kinds of standards when it comes to jobs. So we're looking at very tight labor markets in much of the Western world, but in many emerging and developing economies, there needs to be a much greater focus on work quality, on living wages, and on putting in place job-creating investments, especially for youth. And finally, the third element that we'll be looking at next week is the parity agenda. So a much greater focus from business when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, specifically looking at gender parity, looking at racial equity, the inclusion of people with disabilities, and those that are LGBTQI. And in addition to that, we'll also be looking at equity from a more macro perspective. As we head towards a green transition, as we put in place these new investments and new kinds of policies, how do we ensure that this will be an inclusive agenda for all? And in particular, how do we ensure that this will be a just and equitable green transition? Those will be some of the things that will be top of the agenda next week, and next week will be a milestone, and much of this will continue over the course of 2023. Thanks, Adrian.
Saadia, thanks very much. Mirek, you've been tasked with putting together this very complex, very rich agenda for the week ahead. Can you give us some idea of how that plays out, and also the participation of business in making that happen?
Thank you very much, Adrian. Yeah, let me provide further details on the program next week, as well as provide an update on the business participation. First off, I was really struck by what Professor Schwab mentioned around the very focals, really the need to see and confront the challenges right in front of you, while at the same time shifting flexibly and quickly to look to the distance, to look to the future. In a way, there is an unprecedented need to be able to simultaneously deal with the here and now, as well as invest in the future. So this is really going to be a basic tenet of the program, of the agenda, next week at the annual meeting. Another key tenet is the ambition to reinstitute a collective sense of agency. We've been deploying a lot of defensive measures in response to some of these cascading crises that have been manifesting themselves in the international system. So how do we go on the front foot and really articulate and implement vision-driven, future-oriented business strategies and governmental policies that can help us be more resilient in the future? With these two basic tenets for the program in mind, the agenda next week will be very comprehensive, as Professor Schwab said, fully corresponding to the charged and busy agendas of leaders around the world. And we'll be particularly looking at opportunities to do the systems mapping and really take a systems leadership on some of these crucial issues to drive systems positive change on the global agenda. Thematically, my colleague Saadia Zahidi covered two big themes for the annual meeting: the economy and society. They're obviously interconnected, and so just to complement, on the economy, we're going to be putting a lot of emphasis on infrastructure, and particularly how do we make sure that the investments around infrastructure, particularly around clean energy infrastructure, how do we make sure that this leads to new growth that is more inclusive and makes us more resilient in the future. On the societal front, just to add that, of course, we'll also be looking at social vulnerabilities that are stemming from these crises, but also giving unprecedented space to bottom-up solutions to around social innovators. So there'll be unprecedented space given in the program to particular representative of the Schwab Foundation for Social Entrepreneurship members, but as well as other people that are innovating in society. So another big theme is going to be industry. How do business leaders, also with this very focals lens analogy, how do they look to 2023? How do they navigate the headwinds around geopolitics, the geoeconomic headwinds, supply chain headwinds, while at the same time investing in the future, particularly around innovation, talent, hugely important. On climate, nature, and energy, this is the embodiment of systems leadership, if you will. And my colleague Huay will talk about it, but just to say that we will be putting a lot of emphasis on taking a global view to make sure that particularly after COP27, as you know, hosted in Egypt, in Africa, Middle East, how do we make sure that we really take a global view and around that system of climate, nature, and energy. Finally, our President Børge Brende covered the geopolitical and geoeconomic landscape that we will be set within. And so just to say that this is really running through the entire program. How do we stem the tide of fragmentation so that we can enable progress on the other thematics will be of really critical importance. On the business participation, we will have highest ever business participation at the annual meeting in Davos, with over 1,500 leaders registered across 700 organizations, including over 600 of the world's top CEOs. Among those will be close to 100 innovators. So again, speaking to the need to offer new solutions to disrupt positively bottom up. We will have also the highest representation ever of women business leaders among the business leaders registered. And in terms of sectors, all sectors will be represented. And obviously, again, we will be setting it in the larger frame of how do these industries really contribute to the larger systemic need for progress. Finally, we will have key industries and key business leaders represented from all geographies of the world.
Mirek, thanks so much for that. Environment and sustainability are also going to be a big part of the annual meeting. Huay, you lead the forum's work in that area. Can you tell us a bit more about what we can expect?
Thank you, Adrian. So at the annual meeting, we will premiere a plenary briefing by climate scientists on the state of our global commons. And today, climate change, ecosystem collapse are the biggest threats to humanity. Temperatures have now risen to at least 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. Number of climate-related disasters has increased almost 35% since the 90s. The rate of deforestation has declined. That's good news, but we are still removing forests at 10 million hectares a year, with annual extinction of 50,000 plant, animal, and insect species on an annual basis. And every minute, one garbage truck of plastic is dumped into our ocean. And we're still accumulating problems. What we'll do at the annual meeting is to connect leaders to focus, to understand, focus and act on the most critical environment issues facing the world. And the meeting will focus on how we will reshape and lay a new foundation for agricultural industrial systems, address changes needed in our production and consumption models, while dealing with the immediate challenges, whether these are lives, jobs, water, food, and energy security issues. And one of the key conversations at the annual meeting will be around the business case for climate adaptation, which highlights how we will need to deal with immediate climate realities while mitigating emissions. 5 areas of focus. Number 1, getting to net zero. 2, building a nature-positive economy. 3, regenerating food, water, and ocean systems. Circular use of resources. And finally, addressing waste and pollution. And this builds on progress at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, CBD 15 in Montreal very recently, and toward COP28 in UAE. And we'll look at the interconnectedness, interdependencies of issues and solutions. My colleagues have spoken about that. I'll give some examples. So when we discuss renewables, electrification, we'll need to consider land and ocean use, whether these are the production of biofuels, offshore wind, availability of critical metals and minerals, jobs and skills required across the value chain. And the annual meeting will focus on concrete solutions that can help us achieve the triple bottom line of people, planet, and prosperity. We will look at risks, but more importantly, focus conversations around the opportunity in the transition using a systems lens. Our new Nature Economy report has highlighted that there is an annual business value of $10 trillion in 15 transitions across the 3 systems of land, water, ocean use, infrastructure and the built environment, as well as the energy and extractive sector. And as a concrete example, the energy transition will lead to a surge in demand for critical materials needed. We've already experienced the increase in price of many of these commodities. But today, only 5% of lithium-ion batteries are recycled. Less than 1% of rare earth minerals are recovered. And we'll have discussions on how to drive more circularity in our resource use. The annual meeting will continue to foster multi-stakeholder partnerships. And in addressing the challenges, the key message is that everyone has responsibility and everyone can and must contribute to the solutions. The emphasis will be to build communities of purpose, globally, regionally, and locally, as well as across all industry sectors and value chains. One of the reports that we will launch at the annual meeting is how indigenous people can unlock value in nature-based solutions. We will also put a focus on philanthropy and bring the third P into the public-private partnership construct, looking at how philanthropy can be catalytic to unlock systems change and scale public-private action on climate and nature. We need to increase ambition levels, but also build a bias for action. We are running out of time, and the meeting will really focus on how to achieve speed and scale and bring everyone along without compromising on quality and integrity. The cost of inaction or delayed action will be much higher. Just on water, the cost of inaction could be 5 times the cost of action today. Energy transition, Mirek mentioned this, infrastructure build takes time. And if we want to keep within the transition pathways of 1.5, we will need 100 zero-emission steel plants, 200 ships using zero-emission fuels, and facilities, 300 facilities to supply sustainable fuels for the planes. All this needs to be in place by 2030. And they have to be built today if we want them operational on time. So a lot of the conversations will be centered around activating, stimulating the marketplace for green products and services. We have a community of CEO climate leaders. It's 127 of them, and the number is growing. And alongside with thinking about how to transform their organizations for net zero, they will also look at working with suppliers to decarbonize their value chains. And that's very important because you will have a catalytic effect across all sectors of the value chain and in different parts of the world. I'll do a very, very quick update in the interest of time on 2 programs, 1T.org, which is a program that we launched 2 years ago. It's an effort to mobilize the conservation, restoration, and growing of 1 trillion trees by 2030. Land use agriculture accounts for 30% of global emissions. How do we protect intact ecosystems, restore degraded areas, but at the same time introduce regenerative practices? And I'm very glad that we've seen good momentum. We've launched chapters in the US, in Mexico, in the Sahel region in Africa, in the Amazon, as well as in India and China. More than 80 companies have supported the movement, and with pledges of 7 billion trees. At our last annual meeting, the Chinese government announced plans to protect and restore 70 billion trees over the next 10 years. And we have built a community of 130 innovators that are looking at ideas and solutions for land restoration work. There's also a youth hub that we have launched called Generation Restoration, and this has a global reach of 70 million youths. The other program that I'll briefly update is the First Movers Coalition. It addresses industry decarbonization by aggregating demand and looking to work with governments to provide the right policy, financial support. And this was launched as a collaboration between the forum and the US State Department, focusing on materials, long-distance transport, which account for 30% of global emissions. Today, we have 67 companies committing $12 billion in purchase commitments and 10 government partners. Please watch the space because we hope to announce more government and company partnerships at the upcoming meeting. Between 1T.org and the First Movers Coalition, they address 60% of global emissions. There are many other programs which I will not talk about here, and really, in summary, our priorities is really we need to scale ambition, but at the same time also drive speed and scale, build partnerships, work with government, civil society to put in place the right support to enable the transition towards net zero and a nature positive economy. Thank you, Adrian.
Thanks, Kim Huay. So we've got a lot of questions coming in from folks. I'm going to turn first to Ken Choi in Seoul with Chusun Daily. Ken, are you on the line? Can we hear your question?
Yeah, I am here, Adrian. Good to see you. Happy New Year. Yeah, as Dr. Schwab and Mirek said, there are too many things going on in Davos Forum as usual. My question is, if you have to pick one topic that needs urgent heating from the media sector, if you have to choose one topic, what would that be?
Oh boy, yeah. Well, out of the 400 plus sessions, it's not an easy one. So I'll immediately throw that to my boss, Børge Brende. Børge, what's the one thing in answer to Ken's question that we should really be focused on in Davos?
It's a good question. If I were to pick, maybe to agree on a global growth agenda so we avoid a global recession that includes also agreements on trade and investments. If you have economic growth and no recession, you also create jobs and prosperity.
Well, that was pretty quick and well dealt with. Going to turn, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in Davos, Ken. Laurent Thomé. Laurent, you have a question for us.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for taking my question. We just had the COP27, which had very fraught negotiations, and we can expect the same at COP28 later this year. So in what areas can this year's forum help in making the world make progress against climate change, and what are some of the main priorities that you want to discuss?
Sure, maybe, Kim, I'll turn to you on that. And I know you gave us a lot of detail on some of the things that you'll be addressing in the meeting.
First is building that common understanding of the state of our global commons. I think that's very critical for everyone to have a common understanding on the key risks confronting humanity. Two is really for businesses and government to have a full understanding of the kind of risks that they need to deal with, but more importantly, to focus on the solutions. And there will be various conversations centered around risk issues and also business opportunity in the transition, whether this is in renewable energy, electrification, and also the materials that's needed to support this transition pathway. So I would say that a lot of the conversations will be to build communities of purpose, building a common sense of purpose, and also having action-oriented partnerships being formed across industry sectors, as well as within regions to drive the solution space forward.
Børge?
I of course agree with my colleague here. I think the MOU between the World Economic Forum and the UAE host government, as I mentioned, will be critical in the sense that it's also underpinning the importance of the new technologies, how to use the new technologies for having a new breakthroughs also in how we produce energy and electricity globally. I think the financing piece will be critical after COP26 and COP27. We now need to make sure that developing countries and emerging economies can afford what is necessary when it comes to adaptation and mitigation strategies. So working on both those topics also with the incoming presidency.
Thanks, Børge. Turning to ZDF in Germany.
Yes, hello to Geneva, and thank you. I have two questions. As you mentioned, the theme of Davos 23 is cooperation. So where do you see new approaches to cooperation in the fragmented world? And are you concerned about the initiatives like the US Inflation Reduction Act, which is, at least from a European perspective, aimed less at cooperation than at strengthening the US economy? And the second one, you mentioned all the footprints, African footprint, Asian footprint, Latin American footprint. From my perspective, worth noting for me this year is the size of the delegation from the MENA region. What is the growing importance of cooperation with this region for you, and where do you see new approaches to cooperation? Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. I might turn to Mirek and Børge to tackle that question. Maybe Børge, you want to come in first on the second part of Suzanne's question.
No, thank you very much. And I didn't mention in my introduction that we have record participation from the Middle East and North Africa. We have, in fact, 6 heads of states and governments, very strong delegations. And I think this is also reflecting now the importance of the Middle East in the energy transition, in the green transition, We also know that the COP was in Egypt on the climate change, and now it's moving to Abu Dhabi. But also UAE will be hosting the next trade minister meeting, MC 13, that will take place there. So Middle East is also important when it comes to investments with the sovereign wealth funds that are investing all over the world, and what they set as premises for their investments.
Thanks for that. And Mirek, do you see new approaches to cooperation, new areas for cooperation? One of the kind of secrets that you have to keep in preparing Davos is that, you know, we're bringing together a lot of different interests and individuals who might not necessarily share common understandings or views of the world, or have very different or antithetical opinions. What are the areas where there might be some hope for cooperation?
I think overall we are seeing, because we do deal with a more competitive international system, but we are seeing also efforts to be just a little more practical around where progress can be made, given the reality that we deal with. Børge mentioned trade. You may know that MC12 was actually quite a success within a competitive environment. Børge Brende also mentioned the amazing success of the African free trade area that is being established. This is really a change maker in terms of the future of Africa. So you could say also a lot of those practical approaches are stemming from different regional groupings. Public-private partnerships is really also one of the in a more competitive space there. So overall, again, we'll be looking at concrete opportunities where we can move the needle, while of course we are hoping that also we can stem the larger tide of fragmentation, actually arrest it, and have larger effective mechanisms for diplomacy and cooperation.
I do know that we can expect candid discussions between U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Vice President of the European Union, Dombrovskis, on the IRA. We know that industry policy is back, not only in the U.S., but many other parts of the world. I think what will be important moving forward is to establish clear rules and regulations on this, because we know that also supporting research and development and certain industries for growth is also doable under the current WTO agreement, but it is important that we still work with the aim of a level playing field. So this will be interesting discussions among the 30 trade ministers also in Davos.
Thanks, Børge. Turning to the UAE now and the national, Mustafa Al-Rawi. I don't know, Mustafa, if we can go to you for your question. And brilliant, we just popped up somebody who wasn't Mustafa. And apologies to whoever it was we popped up there. We're just going to try and see if we can get to Dubai for that question. That was Peter from CGTN. And their team are working on trying to get Mustafa up for us. But while we're doing that, maybe we can go back to Peter from Chinese Global Television. Okay, no, I'm being told we have got Mustafa on the line. So Mustafa, let's hear your question, please.
Thank you for your time and for this briefing. Just to ask, given all the hope for cooperation, and there was some discussion that we would avoid, hopefully, a global recession, but already some sectors, such as tech, are facing a downturn. How difficult does that make the potential for cooperation when we're already dealing with job losses and a reduced outlook?
Thanks for that. Saadia, that's very much in your wheelhouse.
Thanks, Adrian. I think there's a complex picture here, and I think we have to sort of embrace the full understanding of that complexity. On the one hand, yes, you're absolutely right that we're seeing some major headlines around certain parts of the tech sector, but much of what we'll be trying to look at next week is the emerging opportunity to deploy technology across multiple sectors, including agriculture, including education, including energy. And that actually means technology is much more ubiquitous across multiple sectors, and there's a huge opportunity there for further job creation, for further growth, especially in emerging markets, and a much more positive outlook. To do that, however, we have to put in place the right kinds of investments that Børge was talking about, and that's where we'll focus much of the conversation. To come back, though, to the short term, we will be looking also at that recession risk in the shorter term, but I think it still lies within the hands of the policymakers and leaders that will be gathered next week to put in place the right kind of growth agenda and ensure that it is there's as little damage as possible and a much faster recovery.
Thanks for that. I think we have time for a couple more questions. If we can go back to Peter. Peter, your question.
Hello, thanks very much for coming to me. Thanks very much for the briefing. How is the World Economic Forum this year looking to align economic goals with the fight against climate change, particularly considering the current period of fractured relationships around the world that we're seeing?
Yeah, Huay, you mentioned some of that in your opening remarks. Do you want to just perhaps dive a little bit deeper?
I think one of the things that there is a lot more awareness around is that there is no sustained economic growth and development without a healthy planet and stable, cohesive societies, whether you're talking about fresh water or healthy soils. And right now we are seeing escalating risks of inaction, and the longer we postpone the transition, the more risks and consequences we'll likely have to bear as businesses, as societies, as a collective. And one of the key conversations at Davos, and this you'll find in multiple themes, is really where are the business opportunities for the transitions. I mentioned earlier that there are 15 transition pathways that's been highlighted in our New Nature Economy report that presents business value. And a lot of the conversations will be centered not just around how business can seize on these opportunities, but how policymakers, how civil society can contribute and provide the right support so that collectively we can actually catalyze the transition and move to new agricultural, industrial systems and also consumption and production models.
Børge, do you want to add anything on that?
There's not a lot to add to that. It was an excellent answer. I think the cost of inaction far exceeds the cost of action over time when it comes to climate change. So we have to internalize the externalities here. And as Huay also correctly said, the transformation towards a more renewable society also creates a lot of more jobs, because the amount of jobs when you then spearhead and invest in renewables are more than in the traditional fuels and energy sources. And I think we will see many breakthroughs here in the years to come, as we have seen in solar has fallen to 1/10 the price in a decade, on wind 1/7. There will be new breakthroughs in the coming decades that we can't foresee today. I think it will be a very important part of the recovery that we are pivoting towards, then decoupling growth in energy consumption and then the amount of CO2 emissions.
Thanks for that. Final question we have time for from Ishan Tarur. I have to read it out, from the Washington Post. And Ishan's asking if we'll see the same focus on Ukraine that was there in May of 2022 at the annual meeting. Børge, is there going to be a Ukrainian presence in Davos in 2023?
Definitely, we will have a high-level Ukrainian delegation in Davos. I can't disclose the full delegation here now, as some other delegations have asked, also due to security concerns, not to be shared yet. But there will be several sessions related to the war in Ukraine and the fallouts. But also we will continue with the CEOs for Ukraine that was started in May. They will gather again and look at how private sector also can support. So there will be coming more in the run-up to our annual meeting.
Thanks for that. Thanks everyone for joining us on this briefing today. We look forward to seeing people in what promises to be a cold and snowy alpine setting in a week's time. Just for those of you who are based in London, we will be launching tomorrow our global risks report. It's not what we think are the big global risks of 2023, it's what all the experts that we have surveyed and communicated with think are the big risks in the coming years ahead. So we'll be launching that tomorrow in London. Look forward to seeing those of you who can make it there. To everyone who we'll be seeing in Davos, look forward to seeing you in the mountains. Big thank you to my colleagues here in Geneva and also to our founder and executive chair, Professor Klaus Schwab. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye now.
One of the biggest SUV companies in India, Mahindra & Mahindra, is not participating in the Auto Expo 2023.